Snow swept across the empty road as Mark headed home after another long shift, boots cold, breath unsteady. Duke walked close, the last steady piece of his life. He expected nothing that night, until he saw the letter on his doorstep, his name written in a trembling childhood hand. Inside was Caroline's final message. If you're reading this, come to Northwind House. And with it, the deed, a few lines that woke memories Mark thought long buried. By morning, Mark and Duke were climbing the ridge toward the cabin carved into the mountain. But the moment they arrived, Duke froze, ears sharp, body tense. Something inside the mountain felt wrong. Not just rock, not echo, almost as if the ridge itself was struggling to breathe. What had Caroline been guarding all these years? And why did Duke sense it first? Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your state or country below. And don't forget to subscribe. Snow murmured across the valley in thin, restless sheets, brushing over leafless pines and an old road that seemed to vanish into the gray. The sky hung low, heavy and dull, and the air carried the hollow quiet only mountain towns know, where every sound travels far, but never quite reaches the heart. Mark Weaver walked with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, boots sinking into slush that had frozen and melted too many times. He was in his early 40s, but there was a worn, older gravity to him, the kind that doesn't show up in numbers, but in the way a man holds his shoulders. Broad-shouldered, still strong from years of military work, he moved like someone who understood both weight and impact. Measured steps, eyes scanning out of habit more than choice. His face was a map of hard seasons. A square jaw shaded with rough stubble. A nose that had been broken once and healed slightly crooked. Faint lines carved at the corners of his mouth and eyes. Dark blonde hair, cut short and utilitarian, carried early threads of silver at the temples. But his eyes were what gave him away. Hazel, sharp and restless, never fully at ease. They flickered to shadows, to sudden movement, to distant sounds that no one else was paying attention to. That was what the war had left him. A body that still functioned and a nervous system that never came home. Sounds didn't just happen. They arrived like warnings. Silence didn't comfort. It waited. Beside him moved Duke, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat that caught the last of the light in muted gold. Duke's build was solid, but not heavy. Lean muscle under winter fur, paws confident on slick ground. His ears lifted and turned at every distant engine, every raven's call, every shift in the wind. His amber eyes checked the world, then checked Mark, as if constantly asking, "Are you all right? Are we safe?" Duke had never seen combat, but he had learned his veteran the way some dogs learn commands. He knew what it meant when Mark's breathing shortened for no visible reason, when his hand trembled a little lighting a stove, when sleep came as a battlefield rather than a rest. On the worst nights, Duke simply lay with his head across Mark's chest, matching his breaths until they slowed. Tonight, Mark's nose and cheeks burned with cold. The shift at the lumberyard had gone long. Someone had called in sick, and the foreman had shrugged like that was just how life worked. For Mark, it was a blessing in disguise. The more exhausted he was when he got home, the fewer hours he had to lie awake watching scenes in his head that no longer existed in the world. He turned off the main road toward a small rental cabin that wasn't quite home, but at least wasn't a shelter or the back of a car. The cabin's porch light threw a weak yellow pool onto the snow. Duke trotted ahead, tail swaying low, already picturing, if dogs could picture, an old blanket and a metal bowl by the waist ease. Heater. Halfway up the short path, Duke stopped. He didn't just pause, he locked. His muscles tightened, weight shifting forward, ears pricked to perfect points. A soft, uncertain sound rose in his throat, Not a growl, not yet, but a note that said something was wrong. Mark halted behind him, every old instinct flaring awake. For a heartbeat, his mind went somewhere else entirely, to sand-colored roads and sudden flashes of light. His jaw clenched, his hand twitched toward a weapon he no longer carried. Then he made himself breathe, following Duke's gaze. Something sat on the top step of the porch, partly dusted with snow. At first, it looked like a scrap of trash the wind had forgotten to blow away. Then the shape resolved into clean edges. An envelope. A plain, cream-colored envelope, its surface damp at the corners, its presence oddly deliberate against the weathered wood. Mark moved closer, slow and wary, as if the thing might detonate. That was the trouble with a nervous system wired by explosions. Nothing ever looked entirely harmless again. Duke stayed at his side, eyes fixed, body a shield. Mark reached down, picked up the envelope, felt the stiffness of cold paper under his gloved fingers. There was no official seal, no company logo, no threatening red stamp that said urgent or final notice. Just his name, Mark Weaver, written in a hand that made his breath catch. The letters slanted slightly right, loops half formed, the ink a little shaky. He had seen that handwriting on Christmas tags that stopped coming, on birthday cards that never got mailed, on a single note tucked into a book the day she left. Caroline, his mother's older sister, the aunt who had once read him stories on the old farmhouse porch, who smelled of pine needles and soap, who would go quiet whenever people started talking about money and expectations and doing the sensible thing. The woman the adults later mentioned only in half sentences. She's gone back to the mountain. She's not well, you know. She hears things out there, says the hills talk. When Mark was 10, Caroline stopped coming to holidays. A few years later, someone mentioned she'd moved into a cabin near the ridge and preferred to be left alone. Then, eventually, the whispers changed tense. She passed. Years ago, I think. Such a shame. Such a strange one. Mark had accepted the idea of her absence the way you accept weather. There was nothing to be done about it, and no one asked his opinion. Now her handwriting was on an envelope on his step. The unease in his chest shifted into something sharper. Carefully he broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. It was only a single page, the lines uneven as though written by a hand that trembled or rushed or both. If you're reading this, Mark, then the time has finally come. Come to Northwind House. There are things I never got to say, things that now belong to you. The last signature beneath was simple, Caroline. Behind the letter was a second sheet, heavier, official. The header carried the name of a small law office in Ridge County, the ink slightly smudged by time, a deed, to a property known as Northwind House. Location, carved into the stone of Ridge Mountain, half timber, half rock. The legal note at the bottom explained in precise language that upon Caroline Weaver's death, the property and all its contents passed to her nephew, Mark Weaver. There was a reference to delayed contact, difficulties in locating him, an old forwarding address, a returned letter. It ended with a simple line. We have been instructed to ensure this reaches you whenever you can be found. Mark read it twice, 3 times. His heart beat a little too fast, not from excitement, but from the disorienting sensation of being summoned by someone who no longer existed in the world. Caroline remembered him. Caroline had drawn up papers with his name on them. Caroline, the woman everyone had shrugged off as odd, had left him something carved into a mountain. He felt the old, familiar tightening at the base of his skull, the warning sign of a wave he didn't want to ride. If he let himself care, if he let the memories of being 10 and safe on a porch with her voice in his ear come too close, everything else he was holding back might slip. Duke nudged his leg gently, as if feeling the shift in his breathing. Mark glanced down. The dog's eyes were steady, present, as if reminding him that whatever storm churned inside, there was at least one creature standing firmly on the ground beside him. He swallowed and looked back at the page. He could throw it away. That thought came first, sharp and defensive. He could crumple the letter, feed it to the stove, and go back to the small, worn path he'd carved out. Shift work, cheap coffee, empty evenings, sleep that came in fragments and never gently. But the words wouldn't leave. Come to Northwind House. There are things I never got to say. It was so like her not to explain, he thought. So like Caroline to leave a question and trust that curiosity or heartache or duty would fill in the rest. More than that, it was the last line that hooked itself into him. Things that now belong to you. Most days, it didn't feel like anything truly belonged to him. Not a stable job, not a real home, not even his own mind on the worst nights. The idea that something solid, something rooted into stone, had his name on it felt almost unreal. He spent half the night sitting at the small kitchen table, the letter spread out under the yellow bulb, Duke curled at his feet. Snow tapped softly against the window, the heater hummed, and his thoughts walked circles like sentries. He remembered Caroline's quiet defiance, the way she'd listen to the wind as if it carried actual words, the way she'd once told him when he was small and afraid of thunderstorms. Not all loud things are here to hurt you. Some are just the sky remembering it has a voice. The war had taught him something different. Loud things could erase people in an instant, but he still remembered how safe he had felt when she said it. By the time dawn paled the sky, a thin resolve had formed where the ache used to be. Maybe he owed her this much. Maybe he owed himself this much. To at least see what she had built into the side of a mountain. He folded the letter with care, slipped it back into the envelope, and packed what little he had worth bringing. Spare clothes, a battered thermos, a small toolkit, his worn military watch with its cracked face, the faded photo of his unit that he could never quite look at or throw away, and Duke's thick blanket that smelled faintly of earth and dog and something like comfort. The truck started on the third try, engine rattling before it settled into a tired rumble. Duke hopped into the passenger seat, turned 3 circles on the fabric as if testing fate, then lay down with his head on Mark's thigh. The road out of Pine Bend wound upward, trading streetlights for tall pines, houses for scattered barns, then barns for nothing but snow and rock. The higher they climbed, the quieter the world became, until even the engine seemed hesitant to disturb it. Ridge Mountain loomed ahead, its slopes layered in ice and evergreen, its cliffs a dark spine against the dim sky. The closer they drove, the more Mark felt that odd pressure in his chest again, like being watched, but not by a person. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound didn't quite make it out. At last, the narrow road ended at a clearing cut into the side of the mountain. The truck rolled to a stop. Mark killed the engine. Silence rushed in. Northwind House stood a short walk away, half embedded in the basalt wall as if the mountain had grown it. The front was built from weathered cedar, the boards aged to a silver gray that matched the winter light. The roof slanted slightly, bearing a crust of snow and a fringe of ice. A round window near the peak looked out over the valley like a watching eye. Where the cabin met the stone, the join was almost seamless. Wood yielded to rock in a tight line, and the rock itself was smooth and dark, streaked with faint minerals. It looked less like someone had attached a house to a mountain, and more like the mountain had decided to sprout a house. Duke jumped down first, nose immediately to the ground, then to the air. He inhaled deeply, head tilting, ears moving like little radar dishes. His tail, which had been relaxed in the truck, slowly lowered. Mark stepped out into the cold. The air felt different here, not just colder, but denser, as if holding more than oxygen. He took a few steps toward the cabin, boots crunching in the thin crust of snow, and paused at the edge of the wall. Up close, the cedar planks bore scars he hadn't noticed from the truck. Small hammer marks, a hand-shaped smoothing in the grain near the doorframe, places where an old nail had been pulled and replaced. It felt hand-built, stubborn, the work of someone who intended to stay. He reached out, fingers brushing the wood. Something thrummed against his palm. It was faint, almost imagined, a soft, irregular vibration, like a distant muffled drum beat. Not mechanical, not the steady buzz of a machine. It rose and fell in a strange rhythm, as if something inside the wall exhaled, paused, then tried again. He pulled his hand back, heartbeat suddenly loud in his ears. "What on earth?" he whispered. He pressed his hand to the wall once more, this time closer to where the wood met stone. The sensation was clearer there, traveling from the rock into his skin. It reminded him of pressing his ear to the ground in training, listening for far-off engines, the tremor of movement before it reached the surface. Duke moved in beside him, sniffed the seam between wood and mountain, then went utterly still. The dog's eyes narrowed slightly, ears pointing straight at the stone, body aligned with a focus Mark didn't share, but felt all the same. Duke didn't bark, he simply listened. "I know," Mark murmured. "It's not just me, is it?" The old instinct to turn away, to retreat to something familiar and small, flickered through him. He could get back in the truck, drive away, tell himself the deed didn't matter, and the past was best left buried. But Caroline's letter sat heavy in his pocket. Her last words echoed in his mind. "Come to Northwind House. There are things I never got to say." He let his hand rest on the rough wood a final time, as if greeting a stranger he halfway remembered. "Looks like we're here, Duke," he said quietly. "Whatever she wanted us to find, it starts now." The mountain did not answer, but somewhere beneath the stone, that faint rhythm continued, subtle, insistent, like a breath that refused to stop. And for the first time in a long while, Mark had the uneasy sense that he wasn't running from something anymore. He was walking toward it. Northwind House clung to the mountainside, like it had grown there long before any human hand touched wood or iron. The evening light thinned into a pale silver sheet across the valley, and the cabin, half cedar, half basalt, seemed to absorb it. Snow whispered around the roof, settling in delicate ridges along the grain of old timber. Mark paused on the threshold, Duke close at his side, both of them listening to the kind of silence that felt inhabited rather than empty. He pushed the door open. The hinges released a long, weary groan, as if relieved to move again after weeks, maybe months of stillness. Cold air drifted out, carrying the faint scent of cedar, dried herbs, and stone cooled for generations. Inside, the cabin was narrow but thoughtful, each object placed with intention. A small table stood beneath a window that looked out into a ravine cloaked in winter. Shelves lined two walls, heavy with jars of pressed leaves, stones labeled in neat handwriting, coils of old rope, bundles of wild lavender that had lost their color but not their scent. Mark inhaled slowly. Caroline had lived here, touched these things, breathed this air. The weight of that realization pressed against him. She had been alone, yes, but not abandoned. This house had been companion, anchor, witness. Duke sniffed across the floor, each step deliberate. His tail hovered level, not wagging, not tense, somewhere between curiosity and caution. He paused at one of the shelves, sniffed a jar of crushed pine needles, then continued. Mark approached a desk built directly into the wall, smoothed by hands long gone. Papers lay in stacks, diagrams, sketches, notes crowded with margins. He picked up the top sheet, brushing away a thin layer of dust, rock cross-sections, arrows showing pressure shifts, curves representing underground airflow. Beneath the drawings, moisture inconsistencies noticed again. Echo patterns wrong for solid basalt. Cavern depth uncertain, need to map again. He frowned. Caroline had been studying the mountain, but not academically, with devotion, with worry. Duke suddenly stiffened. His whole frame went alert, ears high, tail straight, paws planted. A low vibration of breath left his chest, not a growl, but a warning. Mark set the papers down and crossed the room in 2 strides. "Easy," he murmured, though the unease coiling inside him was similarly sharp. Duke's gaze fixed on the rear wall, where the cedar planking ended and the basalt face of Ridge Mountain began. The stone was darker than the rest of the room, its surface smooth, unmarred, cold even from a distance. Mark stepped closer. He placed his hand against the rock. Something pulsed beneath it, faint, irregular, not mechanical, not the steady hum of a generator or the dull thud of distant machinery. A tremor, a breath, a long, slow exhale through layers of ancient stone. The vibration traveled through his fingertips, into his wrist, up his arm, something primal and unsettling, like leaning into the chest of a giant creature and feeling its heartbeat slow but steady. He jerked his hand back slightly, not out of fear, but from the raw unfamiliarity of it. "What is that?" he whispered. He pressed his palm to the stone again, this time sturdier. Duke leaned closer to the wall, nose brushing the seam between timber and rock. His ears twitched rapidly, tiny adjustments tracking something Mark couldn't yet perceive. Maybe a pitch, maybe an airflow, maybe a rhythm too subtle for human senses. Mark remembered faint childhood whispers. Caroline sitting on a porch swing, telling him that mountains weren't silent, they simply spoke in a slower language. He'd forgotten that, or ignored it. He followed a narrow ladder up into the loft, Duke waiting at the base, paws uncertain on the rungs. The loft held a cot with a wool blanket, a wooden crate of notebooks, and a circular opening carved directly into the stone that framed the valley like a painting. Mark lifted a notebook and opened to the first page. Breathing Caverns, My Foolish Dream Study. The ridge isn't hollow. It's layered with chambers that move air through moisture pockets. When one chamber collapses or becomes blocked, the others strain. If the balance breaks, the valley dries, fires spread, soil fractures. People won't understand. They never have. He stared at the words. Caroline hadn't been eccentric. She had been observant, deeply so. Before he could read more, Duke barked once, sharp but not loud. A knock at the door. Mark descended the ladder, tension sliding instinctively into his muscles. Duke positioned himself between Mark and the door, protective but silent. Mark cracked the door open. A woman stood there, cheeks flushed with cold, snow melting into the folds of her deep green parka. Her hair, dark brown, almost black, was braided over her shoulder, the wind having loosened several strands that framed her warm, steady face. Her eyes were dark, thoughtful, the kind that noticed small things without judgment. "Hi," she said gently. "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. I'm Beth Harper." Her tone held the mountains in it, soft edges, firm center. "I saw your truck from the trail," she added, glancing toward the slope. "Figured you'd need help getting settled before the storm builds." Mark hesitated. He wasn't used to strangers reading him so easily. Beth slipped off her gloves and offered a small smile. "Caroline was my godmother. I helped her with errands, groceries, doctor appointments, mail, including the letter she left for you." That struck deeper than expected. He stepped aside. Beth entered, brushing snow from her coat, revealing a fitted sweater and worn jeans tucked into winter boots. She moved with the grounded confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime walking uneven mountain roads. Duke approached her, slowly. She held still, no reaching, no sudden moves. Duke sniffed her hand and accepted her presence. "He's a beautiful shepherd," she said softly. "Good posture, smart eyes." "He's 5, Mark said. "That's a great age, loyal but still curious." Beth's gaze shifted toward the basalt wall. "So, you felt it?" Mark's heartbeat ticked faster. "What do you know about it?" "I grew up hearing the stories," she said, approaching the stone with reverence. She pressed her palm flat, eyes half closing. "Caroline used to say the mountain breathes. Most folks around here just thought it was her poetry talking. But she wasn't wrong. There is airflow inside, sometimes strong, sometimes subtle." "You believe it?" Mark asked. Beth turned to him with quiet certainty. "It's not a matter of believing, it's something you feel." He watched her, feeling strangely seen. "She spoke about you," Beth continued. "Not often, but whenever she did, it was with hope. She kept saying you'd come back when you were ready." Mark's jaw tightened. "I didn't come back. She called me." "She gave you the house because she trusted you," Beth said, "and because she wanted someone who listens to stand where she once did." Mark swallowed hard. Duke lay against the stone again, ear pressed close as if tracking a whisper from deep beneath the earth. Beth watched him. "Animals hear things we can't. Your Duke, he's already in tune with this place." Mark looked at his dog, then at the wall, then at the worn notebooks in his hand. Everything felt connected. The house, the mountain, Caroline's unfinished work, Duke's instincts, Beth's unexpected arrival, and somewhere inside the stone, a rhythm pulsed again, soft, almost shy, like the mountain offering a second breath. Beth stepped closer to Mark, her voice low, steady. "Whatever Caroline left for you, you're not meant to face it alone. If you need help, just ask. She'd want that." Snow thickened outside, tapping the cedar roof like distant footsteps. Mark felt it then, not fear, not sorrow, but a pull, a summons deeper than memory. He wasn't here to inherit a cabin. He was here to finish a conversation Caroline never got to speak aloud. And the mountain, patient for decades, had only just begun to breathe. Snow thickened against the window as the early evening pulled itself over the ridge. The cabin felt warmer now, not because the air had changed, but because another presence, human and steady, had entered its walls. Beth Harper stood near the table, unwinding her scarf, letting it fall over the back of a chair. Her dark braid, loosened by the wind, framed her face as she surveyed the room with the ease of someone who had known it in another season. Mark watched her with quiet uncertainty. She was not a stranger, not exactly. Caroline had trusted her, and in the dim glow of the old lantern he had lit earlier, she moved with a familiarity that made the house feel slightly less haunted. Duke lay across the floorboards, half vigilant, half resting, eyes tracking Beth with curiosity, but no alarm. His tail tapped lightly once against the wooden floor, a sign he had decided she belonged here. Beth noticed. "He's friendlier than most shepherds I've met." "He's selective," Mark replied. "Takes him a while to trust anyone." "Then I'm honored," she said, smiling faintly. Beth removed her parka, revealing a wool sweater the color of moss and a silver pendant shaped like a pine cone. She was in her mid-30s, maybe edging toward 40, with the kind of strength that didn't come from gyms or training, but from steady daily work, stacking wood, hauling water, walking rough trails. Her hands were calloused along the edges of her palms, her knuckles slightly reddened from winter air. She carried herself with a blend of gentleness and resilience that reminded Mark of Caroline. Once the snow settled again into its whispering pattern, Beth's gaze drifted toward the basalt wall. She used to sit here, Beth said, pulling out a chair and lowering herself into it slowly. Right here, every night, after her hands got too weak for tools or gardening. She said the mountain had a voice, but it didn't speak in words. Mark leaned against the countertop, crossing his arms over his chest. Did she ever explain what she heard? Beth shook her head. No, she didn't want to shape it into anything human. She said if she tried to name it, she'd misunderstand it. Mark looked at the notebooks he had stacked on the table. She was studying something real, the caverns, the airflow. She knew more than people gave her credit for. People usually misunderstand quiet women, Beth said softly, especially the ones who listen more than they talk. Mark didn't answer. His own memories were beginning to stir, Caroline reading to him, teaching him the sound pine trees made when winter settled in, showing him how to hold his breath to hear the distant hum of insects in summer. But there were other memories, too. Arguments between his mother and Caroline, his father's muttered opinions, the long stretches of silence from the mountain home. He remembered feeling torn even as a child, too young to choose, too old not to feel the tension. Beth folded her hands on the table. She kept a lot to herself, but she trusted me with some things, especially near the end. Mark stiffened at the phrase. Beth watched him carefully. I'm sorry. I don't mean to push. I know it's a lot. He shook his head, taking a slow breath. No, I should have come sooner. Beth's expression softened. We all have our wars, Mark. Some we fight on the outside, some inside. Timing rarely feels right. He met her eyes, surprised by the steadiness there. Not pity, not prying, just recognition. Before the moment stretched too far, the door rattled lightly in the wind, breaking the tension. Beth rose and walked to a small cabinet near the wall. Caroline wanted someone to hear the mountain the way she did. I think she believed that someone was you. I don't know why, Mark murmured. Beth glanced at Duke. Maybe she knew the right people don't always choose themselves. Mark wasn't sure how to respond to that. Beth reached into the cabinet and retrieved a thin wooden box. The lid was carved with swirling lines, patterns marking airflow, erosion, and what looked like the path of an underground river. She set the box on the table gently, brushing off a thin veil of dust. She left this for you, Beth said. Told me to give it to you only when you came to the house, not by mail. Mark slowly opened the lid. Inside lay a single object, a round pocket compass made of tarnished brass. The glass was scratched, the needle faintly rusted, but it still moved. On the inside of the lid, carved into the metal, were 4 words. Where the mountain breathes. Mark stared at it for a long moment. Duke rose suddenly, body rigid. He moved toward the basalt wall again, nose testing the air. A faint rumble, so faint Mark thought he imagined it, passed through the floorboards. Beth froze. That's stronger than before. Mark placed the compass carefully on the table. You've felt it? Yes, she said, but never this clear. The vibration faded, leaving a strange silence in its wake. Beth crossed her arms tightly, rubbing her hands to warm them. I think Caroline was afraid of something. She never said it outright, but she grew protective, especially of this house. Mark frowned. Protective from what? Beth hesitated. From people who don't listen. Before he could ask more, the door swung open abruptly, letting in a blast of snow. A man stepped inside without waiting for permission. Broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick construction jacket with reflective stripes. He had a weathered face, dark beard peppered with gray, and eyes as sharp as broken shale. His boots left heavy, wet prints on the wood. Duke growled instantly, placing himself between Mark and the stranger. Beth's voice sharpened. Caleb, you can't just walk in. The man, Caleb Ward, removed his gloves. With a smirk. Caleb was in his mid-40s, muscular, the kind of man built from labor rather than exercise. Deep creases lined the corners of his eyes, not from laughter, but from squinting against years of hard winters and harder jobs. His jaw carried a thin scar that disappeared into his beard, a reminder of some past accident. "Relax, Beth," Caleb said. "Snow's picking up. I figured you'd be here, and I figured he jerked his chin at Mark, would show up eventually." Mark's posture stiffened. "And you are?" "Caleb Ward, foreman for Ridge County Development." Beth cut in sharply. "That company has been trying to buy Caroline's land for years. Why are you here?" Caleb ignored her and stepped closer to Mark, studying him. "You're the nephew, the veteran." Mark didn't reply. Caleb continued. "Word is, you inherited this place. Just want to make sure you understand the situation." "What situation?" Mark asked. Caleb's expression darkened. "This ridge isn't safe. Chambers collapse. Airflow shifts. The whole mountain could crack open one day. Your aunt refused to move. Said she heard things." He snorted. "We tried to warn her." Beth bristled. "You tried to pressure her." Caleb held up a hand. "I'm not here to fight. Just saying, if you're smart, you'll let us buy the property before you sink into the same madness she did." Mark stepped forward. "Get out." Caleb met his gaze evenly. "Think about it." He left as abruptly as he had come, slamming the door behind him. Beth exhaled shakily. "I'm sorry. Caleb used to be decent, but ever since his company started pushing for expansion, he's turned into someone I barely recognize." Mark looked at the compass again. "Caroline didn't leave me something to sell," he said quietly. "No," Beth replied. "She left you something to understand." Duke sat by the wall once more, tail lowered, ears perfectly still. The mountain had grown quiet again, but not peacefully so, as if holding its breath, waiting for Mark. The storm eased overnight, leaving the world washed in muted silver. By morning, the ridge glowed pale under the thin winter sun, its slopes dusted with fresh snow that softened every angle except the dark spine of basalt running behind Northwind House. Mark stepped outside with Duke trotting beside him, both of them pausing as a sharp gust rolled up from the valley. It was warm, not mild, warm, a pulse of heat that didn't belong in winter. Mark frowned and rubbed his hands together, breathing out slowly. "That's not supposed to happen." Duke's reaction was immediate. His ears snapped forward, tail stiffening, posture straight and alert. He sniffed the air repeatedly, pacing a tight circle before he stopped and stared toward the ridge's lower slope. The warmth came again, this time with a faint, dry scent, like scorched pine. Mark followed the dog's line of focus. "Let's check it out." They began the descent along a narrow trail carved between snow-coated brush. Duke stayed ahead, nose low, paws moving fast but assured. The trail bent sharply around a cluster of wind-twisted pines and opened into a small clearing where the snow looked strangely thin. Grass poked through, brittle, yellowed, dying at the tips as though starved of water. Mark crouched, running his fingers over the dry blades. They snapped softly. "This isn't right," he muttered. "So soon after a storm?" Duke's low whine drew his attention to the base of a basalt outcrop. A crack ran across its surface, thin but long, stretching like a fault line. From it came a faint hiss, almost like a whispering exhale. Warm air. The mountain was breathing wrong. He moved closer, placing his palm near the crack. Heat brushed his skin, followed by a dry pressure, as if air was being pushed through too narrow a passage. He imagined Caroline sitting in her cabin years ago, listening to tiny changes no one else could feel. "You were right," he whispered to her memory. Something's shifting. As he straightened, Duke suddenly bolted forward, sharp, purposeful, toward a line of trees that bordered the clearing. Mark hurried after him, stepping carefully as the snow thinned into patches of exposed earth. That was when he saw it. A circular patch of ground, stripped bare of snow, ringed by deep impressions, heavy tires. And at the center, a small pile of shaved rock, white dust, fresh cuts in the stone surface, drill marks. He knelt, brushing his hand over the small borehole no wider than a thumb. The edges were clean, angled, unmistakably from a powered drill. And not for geological study, it was too rushed, too careless, no protective casing around the hole. Someone had drilled directly into the ridge. Duke barked sharply, the sound echoing off the stone. His fur rose along his spine, tail pointed toward another set of tracks leading into the trees. North Star, Mark whispered, jaw tight, or Caleb's crew. The tracks were a mix of boot prints and cart-like wheels, likely hauling equipment. Mark followed them deeper into the woods. The light dimmed under heavy branches, the air thickening with the same unnatural warmth filtering up from beneath the earth. 100 yards in, the tracks ended abruptly at a drop-off where the land fell into a small ravine. And there, half camouflaged by branches and tarps, was a portable drilling rig. It was smaller than industrial rigs, built for covert or preliminary work. A steel tripod anchored over a slanted rock face. A hydraulic arm held a drill head, retracted but still warm to the touch, its casing smudged with dust. Someone was working illegally on Caroline's land. As Mark examined the site, a twig snapped behind him. He spun quickly. Duke lunged to stand between him and a man who had stepped from behind a fallen spruce. The stranger lifted both hands. "Easy. I'm not here to start anything." He was in his early 50s, dressed in a thick canvas work jacket layered over a plaid shirt. A knit cap covered most of his thinning hair, and his beard, salt and pepper, short, uneven, suggested someone too busy or too tired to maintain it. His eyes were a muted blue, weary but clear. Dirt streaked his gloves and boots, and the badge clipped to his jacket read, North Star Subcontractor, Survey Division. Mark straightened. Surveying doesn't involve drilling into protected basalt. The man sighed and pushed the cap back. "Name's Alan Brooks. Look, I didn't want to be part of this, but orders are orders." His voice was rough, like someone who'd spent a lifetime around machinery and cold mornings. Yet something in his posture hinted at reluctance, slumped shoulders, slow breath, the guilt of a man who didn't like what he was doing. Mark narrowed his gaze. "You're trespassing." "I know," Alan said. "Believe me, I know. But North Star says if we don't map the subsurface pressure pockets, they'll find someone else who will, someone with less caution." Duke growled, deep in his chest. Alan's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from strain. "I told Caleb this ridge wasn't stable, but he doesn't listen. He just sees land value, roadway potential, tunnel networks, resource extraction." He rubbed his face. "Your aunt, Caroline, she always told us to stop, said we break something we didn't understand." Mark felt a cold clarity sharpen through him. She was right. Alan looked at the ground. "Yeah, she was." Mark stepped closer. "Tell me the truth. How much have they drilled?" "More than I'd like," Alan said quietly. "We've opened 3 test shafts. They said the caverns below weren't important, just empty pockets." He gestured helplessly. "But the pressure shifts. I can feel them. The readings jump all over. Sometimes the rock hums." Duke barked once, sharp, confirming. Alan flinched. "There it is again. That vibration. You feel it too?" Mark nodded. "It's not just the rock. It's the airflow. You're choking the mountain." Alan exhaled shakily. I tried telling Caleb. He laughed, said mountains don't breathe. Mark's jaw tightened. He should come stand where we are. A small plume of warm air drifted upward from the borehole, swirling snowflakes into erratic spirals. Alan watched it with troubled eyes. The ground started cracking yesterday. Not big fractures, but enough that the rig operator nearly twisted an ankle. He hesitated, lowering his voice. We shouldn't be here. Mark stepped between him and the rig. Then help me stop them. Alan hesitated, not out of fear of Mark, but of losing a job he clearly relied on. His hands shook as he pulled in a breath. I'll tell you this much, he said. Caleb is pushing for full-scale drilling next week. Bigger machinery, a pipeline project. He wants to open a corridor straight through the ridge. Mark felt his heartbeat thud once, hard. A pipeline, through the caverns. If they do that, Alan whispered, the pressure pockets will collapse. The caverns will implode. You'd lose this whole side of the mountain, the valley along with it. Duke barked again, urgent now. The ground beneath Mark's feet trembled, subtle but real. A ripple, a reminder. Alan stepped back. I can delay my reports, a day, maybe two. But Caleb will catch on. That's enough, Mark said. Just give me time. Alan nodded, defeated but grateful. I'll do what I can. He slipped away through the trees, leaving Mark alone with Duke and the trembling earth. Mark crouched, placing a hand flat against the warm ground. What did they do to you? He whispered to the ridge. The vibration rose, a sick, uneven pulse, a breath struggling through blocked air. Duke pressed against his side, whining softly. Mark looked toward the distant outline of Northwind House, carved into the stone like a memory refusing to fade. We'll fix this, he said quietly. Caroline didn't leave me this place to watch it die. Above them, the ridge groaned faintly, its fractured breath echoing through the cold morning air. The sky warned them before the wind did. Gray clouds thickened into a heavy lid, sweeping fast over Ridge Mountain like a closing hand. Mark stood on the slope outside Northwind House, watching the horizon churn with a strange metallic tint. Too dark, too fast. Duke paced at his feet, tail stiff, ears pinned toward the valley where the tree line shuddered violently. Beth stepped out onto the landing, pulling her coat tight. Her braid whipped over her shoulder, loose strands sticking to her flushed cheeks. That looks bad, she muttered. Really bad. Mark nodded. That's not a normal front. It's collapsing airflow. You mean, because of the drilling? Yeah, he said quietly. The mountain can't regulate pressure. That storm's going to hit like a hammer. Duke barked sharply, the sound echoing through the cold air. He bounded toward the trail, then whipped around as if urging them to follow. Beth frowned. He senses something. Mark was already moving. He hears distress before we do. They followed Duke down the winding slope, snow beginning to bite at their faces as the storm gathered force. The first gust hit them halfway down, scattering powder into the air like dust from broken glass. Trees swayed, loose branches snapped, the wind roared, not like a storm, but like something being forced through a narrow throat. The mountain was choking. Duke veered left, nose to the ground, then sprinted toward a small ravine. Mark and Beth slid down the incline, boots carving lines in the softening snow. At the bottom, Duke stopped abruptly, barking at a jagged opening in the rock. It wasn't a cave, more like a shallow crevice, wedged between fallen logs and debris swept down by the rising wind. A shout came from inside. "Help! Somebody! Please!" Mark's body tightened instantly. He dropped to his knees and peered through the opening. A young man, maybe mid-20s, lay half buried under a sheet of broken timber. Snow clung to his jacket and hair, and blood streaked across his temple. His face, pale, scared, barely conscious, twitched when he saw Mark. Duke whined, pushing forward urgently. Mark turned to Beth. "Find branches, anything sturdy." She was already grabbing a fallen limb, her movements fast and precise. Mark squeezed through the narrow gap, boots scraping against rock. "Hey kid, stay with me. What's your name?" The young man blinked hard, struggling to focus on him. Evan Hale." Mark studied him quickly. Slender frame, dark brown hair soaked with melted snow, freckles across a young face too earnest for a job this dangerous. His jacket bore the North Star emblem, muddy, torn at the shoulder. "You hurt anywhere besides your head?" Mark asked. "Leg," Evan gasped. "Something pinning it." Mark shoved debris aside, freeing Evan's leg just enough to see the damage. A thick timber pinned him at an angle, pressing his shin into the ground. Not broken, but if they didn't pull him out soon, the cold would finish the job the storm started. "Duke, back!" Mark ordered. The shepherd backed up but stayed close, eyes fixed on Evan, reading his panic with uncanny precision. Beth slid into the crevice, bracing herself beside Mark. "Got the branch." Together they wedged the branch under the timber. Mark gripped it tight. "On 3, he said. 1, 2. The storm roared overhead, shaking loose powder from the ridge. 3. They heaved. The timber lifted just enough. Mark pulled Evan free, dragging him into Beth's arms. She held him steady, supporting the back of his head. "You safe?" she asked softly. Evan sucked a breath through gritted teeth. You're Beth Harper. Caleb told us to watch you. And him." His gaze shifted to Mark, full of shock. "You're the guy we were supposed to report on." Mark froze. "Report what?" Evan swallowed, guilt flickering across his pale features. "They think you're dangerous, that you'd interfere with the project. Caleb said you were unstable, that you'd cause trouble." Beth's eyes hardened. "Is that why North Star is still on the ridge?" Evan dropped his gaze. "They hit a blockage." He coughed, wincing. "They drilled into a pressure pocket. It collapsed part of a cavern. Airflow's wrong now. Too tight. Too hot in some places. Too cold in others." Mark felt his stomach tighten. "You damaged the breathing chambers." Evan nodded weakly. "Not me. I warned them. But Caleb, he's desperate. North Star promised him a promotion if he pushed the job through before spring." Beth clenched her fists. "That idiot is going to kill someone." Evan looked up at Mark, guilt crumpling his young face. "I didn't think anyone cared about this mountain. I didn't know it breathed." He stared toward the ridge above them. "But I felt it, yesterday, like a heartbeat under the ground." Duke barked once, loud and sharp. The ground trembled faintly beneath them. Mark looked up. Snow peeled from an overhanging ledge. "We need to move," he said. "Now." Beth helped Evan to his feet. He could stand, but barely. Putting weight on his right leg made him shudder. Mark slung Evan's arm over his shoulders. The climb back up the slope was brutal. Wind slashed sideways, forcing them to lean into each step. Duke stayed ahead, scanning for falling debris, his bark rising whenever he sensed shifting snow or a cracking branch. Halfway up, Evan stumbled. Mark tightened his grip. "You okay?" he asked. Evan nodded shakily. I didn't think you'd save me, after what Caleb said about you." Mark's voice was steady. "That's not how this works." It wasn't a lecture, it wasn't anger, just a simple truth from a man who had seen enough life to know that saving someone was not about sides. When they reached a thicker line of trees, Beth guided them behind a fallen spruce for shelter. The wind tore overhead, screaming through the branches like a furious spirit. Evan's breath shook. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "North Star's drilling. It's not just wrong, it's reckless. We struck a wall of dense basalt yesterday. Caleb insisted we force through it. He said the caverns were myths, but when the bit broke, everything shook." Mark met his eyes. "Show me exactly where." Evan nodded. "I can, and I'll testify if I have to. You saved my life. I won't let them lie anymore." Another gust of heat rolled up from the ravine, not natural, not winter's doing. The mountain exhaled in a broken rhythm, uneven and struggling. Beth wrapped her arm around herself. "It feels worse." "It is worse," Mark said curtly. "If the caverns are blocked, pressure builds. The storm's intensifying because the ridge can't vent properly. If North Star keeps drilling, the mountain will crack," Evan finished, fear hollowing his voice. Duke barked again, turning toward Northwind House's direction. "Let's get him back inside," Mark said, "and then we decide how to stop this." As they trudged upward, Evan leaned heavily against him. "Mark, when Caleb learns I talked to you, he'll fire me, maybe worse." Mark tightened his grip. "You did the right thing. That matters." A tear slipped down Evan's wind-burned cheek, not from pain, but from the release of finally speaking the truth. The storm wailed above them, rattling branches like bones. But for the first time since arriving at Ridge Mountain, Mark felt something other than dread or exhaustion. He felt purpose. Maybe even the faintest spark of hope. Born in a storm, carried by a frightened young man, and heard by a dog who sensed danger long before any human. The mountain's breath faltered again, and Mark knew the fight had only just begun. The storm had dragged half the night with it, leaving Ridge Mountain under a bruised sky and a brutal quiet, the kind that made every sound feel too sharp, too close. Mark stood outside Northwind House with Duke at his side, listening to the snow shift across the upper ledges. Each distant crack of settling ice felt like a shard of memory breaking loose inside his skull. Duke pressed against his leg, sensing the tension that radiated from him in tight, uneven waves. Behind him, Northwind House glowed softly. Beth had stayed, refusing to descend the mountain until Evan's breathing steadied and Mark stopped pacing the floor like a man waiting for another disaster to announce itself. Now, morning had barely thinned the darkness when they reached Frostline Road, the only path down after the storm. The moment they arrived, Mark sensed something was wrong. A truck idled near the general store, not the older models the townsfolk used, but a spotless silver one with the North Star logo shining coldly on the door. Standing beside it was Caleb Rourke. Caleb was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the sculpted look of someone who worked out for the sake of appearances rather than labor. His hair, black and stiff with gel, contrasted with the harsh white morning light. He had the tense jaw of a man who believed every inconvenience was a personal attack. Snowflakes melted against his pressed jacket, but he ignored them, eyes locked on Mark with calculated disdain. "There he is," Caleb said loudly. "The man of the hour." Beth stiffened at Mark's side. Duke growled low. 3 townspeople, Mr. Harson the grocer, Emily Dane from the cafe, and old Richard Boone, stood behind Caleb in a nervous half-circle. Their expressions were mixed, confusion, concern, and something else that made Mark's stomach sink. Fear. Caleb stepped forward. "Let's make this quick. You trespassed on an active work site. You interfered with company equipment. And now one of my men is injured. Evan, still recovering, still too scared to tell the truth publicly." Beth's shoulders squared. "He was injured because your drilling collapsed part of the ridge." Caleb laughed, a short, practiced sound. "Oh? And your source is this guy?" He jerked his chin toward Mark. "A drifter with a temper? A veteran with Issues? The pause before issues was a deliberate blade. Mark felt the cold tighten around him. His breath shortened. The sound of Caleb's voice warped into something deeper, something too close to the shouts he once heard through smoke and dust. Duke stepped forward, hackles lifted. Beth moved closer to Mark, her hand brushing his sleeve, a small anchor in rising panic. "Stop it, Caleb. You're twisting this." "I'm stating facts." Caleb crossed his arms. "Last night, while we were trying to secure equipment, someone sabotaged the lower access road. Snow barriers toppled, tools scattered, chains cut." His eyes narrowed. "Who do you think the board is going to blame?" Mark swallowed, fighting the buzzing in his ears. "I didn't touch your equipment." Caleb smirked. "People like you don't need to. Your reputation does half the work." The words landed harder than any shove. Beth snapped. "Caleb Rourke, that's enough. You're accusing a man who just saved your worker's life in a storm." Caleb's jaw ticked, but he held his ground. "North Star has lawyers, Ms. Harper, and supervisors who know how to speak to a judge. What does he have?" Beth answered before Mark could speak. "Me?" Silence cut through the cold air. Harson shifted uneasily. Emily bit her lip. And Richard Boone, who had known Caroline, looked down at his boots. Caleb scoffed. How adorable, a mountain cabin romance forming already. Beth's face flushed, but she didn't retreat. She stepped in front of Mark fully now, like a shield forged from quiet defiance. "You don't get to bully people on this mountain," she said. "Not Mark, not Evan, not anyone." Caleb's smile vanished. His mask cracked just enough to show the anger underneath, the anger of a man losing control. "This isn't over," he hissed, climbing into his truck. "North Star doesn't lose to sentimental fantasies." The engine roared and the truck skidded back down the road, leaving a churned trail of slush behind. When the sound faded, Beth exhaled shakily. "You okay?" Mark nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the empty road. "He's trying to push me back into a corner. He thinks I'll snap." Beth softened. "You didn't. And that says everything." Duke nudged Mark's hand, grounding him. The shepherd's amber eyes were steady, quietly reminding him that he wasn't alone. They walked back toward the cabin as the sky darkened again with a fresh sweep of clouds. The wind carried a faint groan from the ridgeline, like a lung struggling for air. Mark knew that sound. It echoed through him, stirring memories from years he tried to bury. Inside Northwind House, they settled Evan again. He looked stronger now, but still pale, propped up by folded quilts near the stove. His leg was bandaged, and a bruise stretched along his jaw. "Caleb's furious," Evan muttered. "He'll spin anything he can." Beth sat beside him. "We'll deal with him. Just focus on getting better." Evan nodded, shame flickering across his face. "I should have spoken up sooner." Duke walked over and rested his chin on Evan's knee, a small gesture, but one that softened Evan's tense expression. "He knows," Mark said quietly, "and he doesn't hold it against you." Evan blinked hard, overcome. Outside, dusk deepened. A faint vibration, uneven, strained, rolled under the floorboards. Mark tensed, breath catching. Beth noticed instantly. "It's the mountain again?" "Yeah," Mark whispered. "And it's getting worse." That night, Beth stayed again. She made tea. She checked on Evan. She helped Mark reinforce the shutters as the wind rose. But when everyone finally settled, the silence became too loud. The first tremor hit after midnight. A crack of stone far above the cabin. Mark jerked awake, eyes wide. For a split second he wasn't in Northwind House. He was back in the desert, dust falling after an explosion, ears ringing, air thick with the taste of metal. Duke jumped onto the bed, pressing against him. Beth sat up from the chair where she'd been dozing. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, the lamplight catching the tired worry in her eyes. "Nightmare?" she asked quietly. Mark nodded, unable to speak. She moved closer, her voice soft as falling snow. "It's just us here. Me, you, Duke. You're safe." Mark covered his face with his hands, breath shaking. "I thought I had this under control." "You don't have to pretend with me." He let his hands fall. Beth's gaze held his, not pitying, not prying, just steady, human, present. "I don't want to break," he whispered. "You're not breaking," she said. "You're remembering, and remembering hurts. But it means you're still here." Duke nudged closer, placing one paw on Mark's thigh, as if pledging himself to the moment. Mark's breath finally leveled. Beth exhaled in relief and sat beside him on the edge of the bed. They didn't touch, didn't cross the fragile line forming between them, but something settled in the space they shared. Something quiet, trusting, adult. The wind howled again, shaking the windows. Beth glanced toward the ridge. "Whatever's happening under this mountain, we'll face it together." Mark looked at her, really looked, her tired eyes, determined posture, the tremor in her hands she tried so hard to hide. She wasn't fearless, she wasn't invincible, but she stayed, for him, for this mountain, for the truth. And something inside Mark shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but like a small stone unclenching deep within the earth. He whispered, "Thank you." Beth smiled gently. "Get some rest. I'll keep watch." As he lay down again, Duke curled at his side. The last thing Mark heard before sleep finally pulled him under was Beth humming quietly in the dim glow of the lamp. Not a lullaby. A promise. Snow still clung stubbornly to the streets of Frost Haven when Mark, Beth, Evan, and Duke reached the old town hall. Dawn had barely broken through the slate-colored sky, yet people were already gathering in small clusters at the steps. Farmers, shopkeepers, school teachers, old-timers with weathered faces shaped by winters harsher than this one. They murmured to one another, glancing nervously at the ridge looming over their valley. The building itself was a remnant of another era. Broad wooden beams, tall arched windows, and a stone foundation that creaked in winter, but stood firm through every storm. A faded mural of Ridge Mountain stretched across the entrance hall, painted decades ago when the town still believed the mountain to be invincible. Today, that belief flickered like a fragile flame. Inside, the hall filled quickly. Folding chairs scraped the wood floor as residents settled in. A draft whispered through the rafters, carrying the faint scent of pine and old varnish. Duke followed Mark closely, lying at his feet once they found a seat near the front, calm, watchful, an anchor in the rising tension. Evan sat on Mark's other side. The young man looked exhausted but determined, his face paler than usual, and the bruise on his jaw a dark, stubborn mark. He wore a simple gray sweater that hung too loosely on his slender frame, making him appear even younger than 25. But his eyes, brown, earnest, shaken by guilt, yet steady with resolve, held a new kind of courage. Beth stayed behind them, her presence warm and steady. She had tied her hair back again, but loose strands curved around her cheeks. When Mark glanced at her, she offered a small smile, a reassurance he hadn't known he needed. At the podium, Mayor Linda Bauer adjusted her microphone. She was a tall woman in her early 50s, with an angular face softened only by the streaks of silver in her shoulder-length brown hair. Her voice carried the tone of someone used to mediating disputes between stubborn mountain folk. She cleared her throat. "Thank you for coming," she began. "We're here to discuss concerns regarding North Star Industrial's continued drilling on Ridge Mountain. I know tensions are high. Let's keep this civil." Before she could continue, the rear doors swung open. Caleb Rourke entered with two North Star representatives. Caleb's expression was a mask, controlled, disdainful, pretending confidence he didn't fully hold. One rep, a thin man with a narrow face and sunken cheeks, carried a metal briefcase. The other, a broader man with a salt and pepper beard, scanned the room with a professional coldness. Caleb smirked when he spotted Mark, but Mark didn't flinch. Beth's hand brushed his shoulder briefly. An instinct of protection she didn't overplay, but didn't hide either. Mayor Bauer raised a hand. We'll begin with testimony from anyone affected by the drilling. A murmur swept the hall. People shifted. But then Evan rose. The room stilled. He made his way to the podium, walking with a slight limp from his injury. Duke followed him halfway before Mark motioned the dog back with a quiet gesture. Evan gripped the podium edges, knuckles whitening. "My name is Evan Hale," he said, voice trembling but growing firmer with each word. "I've worked for North Star for 8 months, and I need to tell the truth today, because last night I almost died." Gasps rippled across the room. Caleb stiffened. Evan continued, voice cracking, then strengthening. "We were ordered to drill through a basalt wall that the engineers said wasn't safe. The readings showed pressure buildup. The airflow changed. The instruments warned us. But Caleb..." Evan's eyes flicked to him, then back to the crowd. "Told us to push through anyway. He said delays weren't an option." Caleb shot to his feet. "This is nonsense." "Sit down, Caleb," Mayor Bauer warned. Evan swallowed hard. "We collapsed part of a cavern, a big one. I felt it shift. Hot air rose from below. It wasn't supposed to happen. The mountain, it felt like it was choking." He wiped a sleeve across his brow. "If we keep drilling, Ridge Mountain will lose moisture. The trees will dry out. Fires will start. Streams will shrink. The valley could die." A hush fell. Even the wind outside quieted, as if listening. Evan took a shaky breath. "I didn't say anything because I was scared. I was told Mark Vail was dangerous, that he had a temper, that he'd cause trouble." His voice broke, shame tightening his throat. "But he saved my life last night. He and Duke. If they hadn't found me in that ravine, I'd still be under that timber." The hall seemed to expand with that truth. Richard Boone, the old-timer who used to doubt Mark, leaned forward, eyes softening. Emily Dane pressed a hand over her mouth. Harson, the grocer, nodded slowly, face creasing with empathy. Beth stepped forward, placing a hand on Evan's shoulder in quiet solidarity. Evan finished, "I'm telling you what's really happening, because if Ridge collapses, none of us will have a home." Silence anchored the room for several long seconds. Then Mayor Bauer spoke. "Thank you, Evan. You've shown courage today." Caleb lunged to his feet again. "This is slander. Evan's a temporary hire. He doesn't understand half of what he's talking about." But this time, no one looked his way. The tide had shifted, and the town felt it. A farmer named Dean Tallman stood, a large man in his 60s with a chest like a bear and hands scarred from decades of labor. His voice boomed. "My well ran dry for the first time in 30 years. 30 years. He jabbed a finger toward Caleb, and just when North Star started poking the mountain, another woman, Marjorie Pell, owner of the quilting shop, rose shakily. She was short, round-faced, with rosy cheeks and kind eyes. "The stream behind my house turned muddy last week. I thought it was the storm, but maybe it was something else." More voices followed, more concerns, more cracks in North Star's facade. Mark remained seated, stunned, Duke leaning gently against his shin as if telling him this moment was real. Beth looked down at him. The warmth in her eyes made his breath catch. She stepped forward and addressed the room, voice calm, firm, carrying a steadiness that reminded Mark of Caroline. "Mark didn't ask for this fight," Beth said. "He didn't come here to accuse anyone or cause trouble. He came because Caroline trusted him with Northwind House, and now he's trying to protect the same mountain she listened to every night." She turned toward Mark, her voice softening. "He's come home to Ridge. Caroline would rest easier knowing he didn't walk away." Mark swallowed hard. He hadn't realized how deeply he needed to hear that, not from townsfolk, not from officials, but from someone who saw him beyond old scars and whispered doubts. Applause rose, not wild, not dramatic, but steady and sincere. The kind of applause mountain towns reserve for people who had earned their trust the hard way. Even Duke barked once, as if adding his own vote. Mayor Bauer raised her hand. "Given the testimony today, I'm calling for an emergency geological inspection of Ridge Mountain. Until then, all North Star drilling is suspended." Caleb's face drained of color. His two representatives exchanged tight, panicked glances. But the town had spoken. Mark exhaled slowly as people approached him, offering handshakes, murmured thanks, promises to stand with him. Duke wagged his tail, accepting pats from children who shyly came forward to touch the heroic shepherd. Beth slipped to Mark's side, leaning her shoulder lightly against his arm. "You did good today," she whispered. Mark let himself believe it. For the first time since he inherited Northwind House, he didn't feel like an outsider standing at the edge of a story too large for him. He felt like part of Ridge Mountain again. And that changed everything. The wind moved differently on Ridge Mountain the next morning, lighter, cooler, almost relieved. It no longer hissed or groaned through the slopes, but flowed in soft, steady breaths, as if the mountain, after days of suffocation, had finally found rhythm again. Mark stood outside Northwind House with Duke at his side, watching steam curl gently from the thawing forest. The air felt alive. Beth walked out with 2 mugs of coffee. Her hair was a little mussed from sleep, her expression somewhere between exhaustion and quiet hope. "Ready?" she asked. Mark nodded, rubbing Duke's ears. "He's ready too." They made their way toward the clearing where the townspeople had gathered. Frost Haven had not united like this in decades. Trucks lined the ridge. Neighbors who rarely spoke now worked side by side, shoveling, clearing debris, carrying tools, climbing ladders to assess cracks in stone. The mountain's heartbeat had become everyone's responsibility. Evan stood near a cluster of workers, leaning on a walking stick someone had carved for him. His injured leg was wrapped beneath thick winter pants, but he looked steadier today. A few of his former co-workers, men with calloused hands and oil-stained jackets, worked beside him. These were the ones Mark had helped rescue. Jonas, a tall man with a square jaw. Rylan, younger, wiry, with sandy hair. And Mason, whose deep-set eyes suggested nights of guilt-ridden reflection. Jonas waved Mark over. "Morning," he said, rubbing frost from his beard. "We checked the lower vents. 2 of them are clogged with debris from the drilling. If we clear them, the caverns might normalize pressure." Mark studied the map Jonas had drawn on a scrap of plywood. "We'll have to go in from the east side. That slope is unstable." "Already reinforced it," Mason said. "Your dog helped find the cracks." Duke barked once, tail high, proud of his contribution. By mid-morning, the team headed toward the ridge's eastern face. The entrance to the breathing caverns looked more fragile than before. Stone edges hairline fractured, frost melting into tiny rivulets. The mountain truly had been gasping. Mark led the way, Duke at his heel, head low, alert. Inside, the air was thick but not dangerous. Evan limped beside them, pointing out where the drilling had struck. The basalt wall bore marks of metal teeth, deep, angry scars carved by the drill bit. The sight made Beth shudder. North Star did all this, she whispered. Not all of North Star, Evan said quietly. Just the people who stopped listening. They reached the first collapsed vent. Jonas and Mason wedged pry bars into the debris while Mark pushed at loosened stones. Duke backed up, barking rhythmically, as if signaling the cadence of their work. A sudden crack echoed. Evan froze. Stop! Mark pulled back just as a chunk of stone fell where his hands had been moments earlier. You okay? Beth called, voice strained. Mark caught his breath. Yeah, close call. They redirected their leverage, working slower, supporting the upper slope with timber braces. Inch by inch, the blocked vent reopened. Cool, moist air surged through, brushing their faces like a long-awaited sigh. That's one, Jonas said, wiping sweat from his brow. 2 more to go. Clearing the next vents took nearly 4 hours. Hands blistered, muscles burned, stone dust coated their coats and hair. But with every breath the caverns released, the air grew more balanced, more alive. When the final vent opened, the shift was unmistakable. A rush of cool moisture spiraled upward like steam rising from a healing wound. Mark closed his eyes. The mountain was breathing again. Outside, sunlight pierced the thinning clouds, scattering gold across the snow. Melting droplets shimmered on branches. Green tips, tiny, stubborn, hopeful, poked through thawing earth. The valley had begun to mend. As the community gathered at Northwind House, the sense of victory was quiet but profound. People brought food, tools, blankets, laughter. Someone started repairing the fence. Someone else fixed a shutter. Children played fetch with Duke, who barked joyfully, his tail a metronome of celebration. Beth joined Mark at the porch railing. The house behind them hummed with warmth and voices, no longer a lonely cabin, but a place being stitched back into the town's memory. This house, Beth began softly. It was too big for Caroline at the end, and too big for you alone, I think. Mark looked at her, unsure where she was going. She continued, eyes on the mountains, voice low and steady. Homes like this aren't meant for one person. They need footsteps and arguments about where the mugs go, and someone to remind you to take a breath. She hesitated just a second. If you want, we could share a roof. Not as a big confession, just 2 people who've walked through enough lonely winters. Mark felt something warm unfold inside him, like a slow tide. No fireworks, no dramatic declarations. Just a quiet truth that fit right where it landed. I'd like that, he said simply. Duke nudged their hands together and wagged his tail in approval, earning a soft laugh from Beth. By late afternoon, the townspeople unveiled a simple wooden sign they had carved together. A mix of old and young hands had shaped it, and the wood grain still glowed with life. North Wind Listening House, where people learned to hear the mountain again. Mark ran his fingers over the carved letters. For the first time since receiving Caroline's letter, his chest felt light. Beth leaned her head against his shoulder. Duke sat between them, watching the townspeople with the satisfied gaze of a guardian who had done his job well. Ridge had been restored. The house now had purpose. And Mark, after years of drifting, bracing, surviving, finally had somewhere to stay. Somewhere to belong. In the end, Ridge Mountain became more than a setting. It became a teacher. A place that reminded everyone that even strong things can falter, and even broken places can breathe again if people are willing to listen. Mark learned that healing doesn't come all at once, but through small moments of courage. A hand held out in a storm, a dog who refuses to leave your side, a community rediscovering its unity. Beth found that grief softens when shared, and that a home becomes sacred only when filled with kindness. The townspeople realize that nature responds to how they live, with greed or with gratitude, with fear or with fellowship. And Ridge itself, once choking under pressure, opened again like a living heart. Its restored breath was not just a victory of stone and air, but a quiet testament to what people can accomplish when they stand together. Hope is not loud nor dramatic. It grows in steady acts of love, one person choosing to stay, one neighbor choosing to help, one community choosing to rise. Sometimes miracles do not arrive in flashes of lightning or the thunder of heaven. Sometimes they appear in the steady hands that lift a fallen neighbor, in a loyal dog who refuses to give up, in a community that chooses compassion over fear. And maybe, just maybe, those quiet moments are God's way of reminding us that His light still walks among us, guiding our steps, strengthening our hearts, and bringing warmth to places we once thought were lost.